Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Capitol Hill Ocean Week. We have a great day planned for you. We're going to be featuring a session this morning on ocean noise, then on our public waters and the National Marine Sanctuary System, and then finally one on communications and how we communicate in a crowded space. Just as a reminder, you'll find the full agenda and content along with information about our speakers on the app, CHOW 2017. As a reminder also, you can participate in conversation using the question cards on your seats. I know yesterday we got a lot of really good questions, both from the audience participants and from Twitter, so please take advantage of that. Our volunteers will collect them and bring them on stage. And if you're listening online, please feel free to tweet your questions in at hashtag #CHOW2015 to @MarineSanctuary. Billions of people drive their livelihood and food security from the oceans. Today, the oceans and the life it supports are under threat, though, from overfishing, illegal fishing, pollution from noise and plastics, and most significantly from global climate change. This morning, our panel looks at a very specific issue, and that's the issue of ocean noise. I want to thank Dr. Brandon Southall for moderating Cacophony of the Seas, the Decline of Silent Seas. Brandon is a senior scientist at Southall Environmental Associates and at the University of California, Santa Cruz. As Dr. Southall and our panelists come onto stage, we'd like to share videos from our sponsors. I also just really want to quickly thank our other signature sponsor, NOAA, and our co-hosts, Gordon and Betty Moore, the Campbell Foundation and the Ocean Foundation, along with our other partners, the International Fund for Animal Welfare and the Philip Stevenson Foundation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Nice to see some familiar faces here today. We have a great panel for you. I'm just going to give some very brief kind of setting the stage remarks, and then I'll introduce our panelists and we can take some questions and have some discussion. As many people in this room are aware, this issue of sound in the ocean and its effects on the marine environment has been an issue for several decades. I think the field has really matured and has moved from kind of some of the more dramatic kind of issues about stranding events and dead animals on the beach to some of the broader habitat-related issues and sublethal issues related to behavioral disturbance and communication masking. So that's kind of, as people have realized that we don't have dead animals every time there's sound in the ocean, but there are some really relevant issues, and some of those go beyond marine mammals. So the marine mammals have driven this issue to the forefront, but there are major issues that many of the people here are concerned with that involve fish and invertebrates, and they also involve these sublethal and more chronic habitat-related kind of issues. So the field has matured and evolved into some different kind of things than just a few kinds of sounds and a few kinds of species that may wind up stranded. We've seen a really strong and deep expansion of different kinds of technologies that let us ask in fine detail how animals react to sound, tag technologies, listening capabilities that span entire oceans to be able to monitor habitats and look at where animals are and how they respond to sound, as well as mitigation technologies that enable us to try and reduce the effects of sound by removing or minimizing it, and you'll hear some discussion about that today. The broad-scale acoustic monitoring is really important. Much of that in the early days was really developed and expanded by the Navy, but we're seeing an increase application of civilian systems. NOAA is taking a leadership role here in the US in expanding some of those, and it also highlights the importance of sanctuaries. So we've had different kinds of acoustic systems monitoring in sanctuaries, places that we've identified as biologically important that in some cases have different or less level of human activity, so they can serve as kind of a bellwether of the acoustic environment. So that's an important theme that I hope we'll get a chance to talk about as well. There is an important distinction in thinking about mitigation, particularly between sounds that are produced on purpose to look for something, a specific sound that has a characteristic that's intended to detect and characterize something, and sound that's just a byproduct of moving something from a place to another or installing something. So there's a distinction between deliberate and incidental sound that influences the way that we think about how and why and whether it can be, or to the extent to which it can be mitigated. And I think the overall theme I'll kind of leave it with before I introduce people is the field really has matured. Many of the technologies are there, and more of the implementation and the testing and the evaluation and the implementation of these technologies to understand what's out there, what the issues are, and focus on the things that really matter and be able to mitigate things are there. It's really just a matter of the political and economic will to implement some of these things. Okay, so with that, and it's inherently cross-sectoral in nature. So part of the design of the panel is having some people that are involved with commercial shipping, with offshore energy, that have dealt with some issues related to military issues, people that work on conservation, and we have a good balance, I think, of that in the panel. So I'll kind of go down the line here and introduce you to the folks, and then we can kind of move into discussion. So Mark Walkner is an actual acoustician. I'm a bioacoustician, which means I'm a biologist who dabbles in acoustics, but Mark is actually trained as an acoustician. He has a PhD in acoustics from Penn State. He's done a lot of work on nonlinear acoustics and jet propulsion noise, and did a postdoc at UT Austin. 4 years ago, he founded a company called ADBM Technologies, which is commercializing the tunable underwater noise abatement system. So it's a new product that Mark has co-invented, and he can really speak to technology issues related to reducing the propagation of noise in the marine environment. Kathy Metcalf has been someone I've admired for a long time. She comes from the commercial shipping industry. She's the president and CEO of the Chamber of Shipping of America. She served as CSA's Director of Maritime Affairs for about 2 decades. And she and I got together initially in the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission held a FACA panel in the mid-2000s. And Kathy represented this shipping industry in that process. And one of the things that kind of came out of some of that, and that was motivated by this need or this interest in looking at shipping noise and the ability to reduce shipping noise, was a process which Kathy was instrumental in to get the IMO to look at this issue and to evaluate some specific vessel quieting guidelines that were, after quite a while and moved through the process, made some specific recommendations. So we'll have a chance to talk about those with Kathy and her very progressive perspective on the issue of noise in the marine environment. Johnny Young is also someone that I've had the privilege to work with for a long time. John served in the Navy and then spent a long time working on offshore energy seismic survey related issues and noise related issues for Exxon. He was centrally involved in the the joint industry program that the oil and gas industry has developed to look at sound in the marine environment. He has since moved on and works as the Director of Marine Environment with DHA Water and Environment, and brings a wealth of experience to be able to speak about this issue. And last but not least, Patrick Ramage, the Director of Marine Conservation for the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Before that, he was with the Global Legislators for, what is it again?
A balanced environment.
A balanced environment, sorry, a balanced environment. And he is also very involved as a co-associate producer of the film Silent Seas, which Kathy and I had a small part in, that looked at sound in the marine environment. And he works closely with NRDC and Oceana and can speak to some of the current issues related to conservation and this issue of underwater sound. So I think with that, I have some questions that I have for each of these guys, but we're interested in receiving any questions or comments from folks both in the room or online. And maybe as folks provide those, I'll kind of kick it off, and maybe we can start with kind of a big picture perspective. And Kathy, maybe we could start with the shipping issue, if that's okay. One kind of chain of events, and if you want a history of the chain of events that led from some NOAA symposia that I was involved with Roger Gentry, who's in the audience here, to look at shipping noise and marine mammals. And Roger really saw that we needed to be thinking about these broader kind of chronic issues. And we had a series of meetings on shipping noise and marine mammals that led to some environmental group involvement, and then international involvement through IMO, which Kathy really helped guide us through, along with a dear colleague, Lindy Johnson, who some of you may know in this room. But it took a village of people to get that together. We went through the whole process of evaluating these technologies, working with the engineers, making some specific recommendations. That process went through to 3 years ago, come up with some specific recommendations about vessel quieting guidelines. And Kathy, I'd maybe ask you to just pick up on where you think we are with that issue, how it's going to move forward, kind of how we've done since the implementation of those guidelines, and maybe you could touch on the recent interaction and recommendations through the voluntary commitment at the United Nations Oceans Conference last week.
Sure. Well, good morning to all. It's an honor to be here. Sometimes I feel like I've worked for NOAA more than worked for the private sector, and that's not a bad thing. You already mentioned our good friend Lindy Johnson, who left us too early, but this woman could walk into a room and energize it. And if you knew her and you're in the audience, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I always have to, in one of these kind of a forum, to mention her, because she's very important in my perspective on this issue. Now, the IMO, for those of you that don't play in the international field, is the International Maritime Organization, which is a subsidiary body of the United Nations. Headquarters in London. We meet with a plenary session, looks just like the General Assembly, and we have committees and working groups and things like that. The speed of issue movement at IMO is about like a turtle swimming through syrup. It just doesn't go very fast. And so when Lindy brought me into the fold with not only ship strikes, but then she calls me about 6 months later and says, "You guys are too noisy. You've got to get on this group and start talking about that." We put our heads together to try and figure out what we could do, because the first step towards a solution to a problem is educating the people that are the source of the problem. And that was the biggest push from the beginning, is education. People that sail on ships obviously are not underwater trying to listen to how loud the ships are. We have to rely upon our conservation and environmental groups, our scientists, to tell us that. So At IMO, you have to do a work plan submission and plenary. So there's a lot of teeing up before an issue really will get back on the agenda. We were successful with the guidelines. I'm here to tell you today, I don't believe they're being used for the purpose of noise. They're guidelines. They're non-mandatory. And I'm coming from the regulated industry perspective. So you can take that where you wish. My position right now is where we need to go with this, is we need to get the thing back on the IMO agenda with a movement towards looking at some international instrument that will make it mandatory. Now, the focus on the guidelines right now are on new ships. I don't have a PhD, but these guys have drilled it into me long enough. 85% of the underwater radiated noise of a ship comes from cavitation. Cavitation is inefficient. The big movement afoot over at IMO now towards reduction of emissions, and particularly we're starting 2 weeks from now discussing the commitment for greenhouse gas emissions, is to make ships more energy efficient. If you see where I'm going here, if you reduce cavitation, you increase vessel efficiency. If you decrease cavitation, you decrease the noise profile of the vessel. How can the shipping industry not play in this game? It's a win-win. We're forced to do the energy efficiency, which we need to do anyway, and we're going to get quieting out of it. Some architects, naval architects, would disagree with me, but I think it's a win-win all the way around. So the next step, we think, is to try and it'd be nice if it was a US submission that puts it back on there, but I know there are a number of EU countries that are more than willing. What is going to help doing that at IMO, the IMO Secretary General was in New York at the UN Oceans Conference, and you might want to say something later after that. I was not up there, but a call to action was issued relative to noise. And that will put some gentle pressure on the subsidiary UN bodies that have jurisdiction over things that make noise. IMO, for commercial shipping. So that's where I think we need to go. What we don't want to do, and I'll be the first one to tell you this, the easiest way to quiet a ship is to slow it down. That's not real efficient either, though. So what we're trying to do is find technical and design solutions so we're not caught up in a political momentum to just slow everybody down to 10 knots. I'll stop there.
Patrick, do you want to comment any further?
Sure. I was contemplating Kathy's analogy of a turtle swimming through syrup, which reminded me that turtles are also a species that's affected, and their habitat's affected by ocean noise. And as Brendan alluded to in his introduction, it's not just iconic whale species, including the North Atlantic right whale, that is impacted. A variety of species, including recreational and commercially viable fish, mollusks, lobsters. There's a tremendous impact that ocean noise, whether from Navy sonar, seismic, which we'll talk about shortly, or shipping noise, as Kathy has alluded to, have a dramatic impact on the marine environment. Off our shores here on the East Coast, where this issue is about to play out with some movement back towards seismic exploration and perhaps ultimately drilling in the Atlantic and in waters and critical habitat areas worldwide. It's a serious and persistent issue. The nature of the sound emissions and their impact on animals in the marine environment varies in different cases and with respect to different sources of noise and with respect to particular sites and species impacted. But as a conservation organization concerned with rescuing and protecting animals around the world, the International Fund for Animal Welfare has been pleased to engage together with Lindy Johnson, Kathy, Brendan, and others at the IMO. We've worked closely there with Natural Resources Defense Council and other concerned non-governmental organizations. We enjoy consultative status on great whale issues there, and welcomed the voluntary guidelines. But I also welcome Kathy's candor in terms of the ultimate impact of voluntary as opposed to mandatory guidelines. There is some precedent in IMO for voluntary codes ultimately taking force of regulation, and we're hopeful of that with respect to the ocean noise issue. On the UN Oceans Conference, ourselves and a number of concerned organizations, including the Wildlife Conservation Society, worked hard to ensure, over many months, to ensure that the call to action did in fact include a reference coming out of the UN Oceans Conference to the ocean noise issue. There's a variety of intergovernmental opportunities, UN related and otherwise, over the next couple of years where the ocean noise issue is surfacing in a more serious way. There was also a voluntary commitment that we joined in that contemplates a series of interchanges and subsequent commitments to be made by stakeholders, including, importantly, industry, shipping and seismic, on this issue. So it's, as Brendan said in his opening, it's an issue that's been with us for a while. There's a low level of public and policymaker awareness still, but the issue has been maturing, and it's a question now of engaging and eliciting the political and economic will to take steps. That looks like tough sledding early in this administration, particularly off the coast of the Atlantic and the Atlantic seismic, which I'm sure we'll get to as we move through and hear from John on that.
Okay, I'll say two quick points, and then John, I'm going to turn to you for a question. One, we have a couple of links that'll be up on the website for the session to the voluntary commitment that Patrick mentioned. And I think you talked about kind of political and economic will. And Kathy, I think one thing in your comment was about validation and measurement and seeing how some of these things work. And there's a program going on with the expansion of the Port of Vancouver and a project called ECHO through Vancouver, which we'll also have a link to. And you can check out some of the things that they're doing where they're looking at speed and loading of vessels relative to noise in different categories. And they're looking at financial incentives from the port to people that operate vessels that are quieter. So part of the, 10 years ago, panel or forum that we had on quieting technologies had a whole section on incentive programs. And I agree that, moving from voluntary to mandatory guidelines that are science-based and measurement-based is an important direction. But that will take some time, and one of the other tools in the toolbox is particularly for an issue that has a complicated regulatory framework like incidental noise from shipping, these kind of financial incentives, which they're exploring through this project in the Port of Vancouver, are pretty important. My personal opinion in the US is, given the political realities of where we are, some of the more local and state-based initiatives may be particularly important in the near term. New York and California have shown some leadership recently that we may need to kind of fill what's happening federally. So look for those two links. I'd remind people to send questions up. I can keep firing away. But Mark, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of good news for the ship speed and its relation to noise. One of the things that, now this isn't always true, maybe you have a sound source coming from a ship that's so loud that it can't be there for any period of time because it's so loud. But an interesting thing is that a lot of people are concerned about total noise exposure. And so even though a ship may be quieter, going half the speed, it's there for twice the amount of time. And the noise energy may not be twice as much. So there's some interesting parts to the fact that even there can be an economic advantage to the vessel going faster because they'll be in and out a lot faster, and the total dosage will actually be down. That was something that was brought up at the Ocean Noise Conference in Barcelona just a couple months ago. So that's another interesting thing to think about. It's not always about just total absolute levels.
And some of the issues about routing are particularly important too, because you have this sort of simple idea that you push ships further away from the shore and you move them away from more of the concentrations of animals, which may be true sometimes, but if you push ships onto the shelf and the shelf is angled like that, the amount of noise that you propagate into the basin of the environment may be greater as well. So it does take a thoughtful and measurement-based ways of looking at these things to understand the trade-offs between things that might seem like they're simple, but they're not quite as simple.
We've got to get to John, but I just wanted to add one thing. That sounds like our ship strike argument, doesn't it? Don't slow us down, we're in the area longer, but I just wanted to mention one thing. We are looking at ships from two perspectives. One is a point source and the immediate impact on animals. But more importantly, I think, somebody can challenge me on this, is the collective contribution of the world's fleet to the ambient background noise. And that's what, I mean, it's going to be difficult. If you're on top of a living marine resource, the quietest ship is still going to bother that resource. But when you think of the 60 or 70,000 large ships trading internationally, and that noise collectively in the ocean basins, that's what we really seem to be focused on right now. I will shut up.
John, maybe you could pick up on the issue of seismic surveys, and you've had a long involvement in their use, in their design, and particularly in the development of some alternatives in different ways, things that people are doing to kind of conventional air gun systems as well as alternative ones. And maybe you could just kind of highlight some of those and talk about where you think that's going.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks everyone for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today. Seismic alternatives. I don't know the educational level of the folks in the audience on seismic, but typically today there is a energy source that uses compressed air, and it's an impulse source. So all the energy is released at one given time in a very fraction of milliseconds. It's milliseconds in time. So that's one way to put energy in the earth. Another way to put energy in the earth is to take that signal and spread it out over time. And if you look at the total energy, you can make it about the same as what the impulse was, but you don't have maybe potentially quite the impacts that you get from an impulse source. So back in the 60s, Conoco were developing a technology called vibrosize. And they used this technology on land to begin with. And the reason they used it, believe it or not, was both environmental and safety reasons. Handling the other alternative, they would drill a hole and shoot large amounts of dynamite in the hole. That can get pretty scary. It can be very unsafe. You can have issues of water wells. On the ranchers don't like you shooting dynamite near their water wells or their houses. So there were those issues, and they came out with this big machine, and it would vibrate the earth. And that signal was then used in the processing of the data. Once the data is received, they could take and collapse that signal back into a pulse. And they want that pulse, a geophysicist does, in order to delineate between the different layers in the earth, because ultimately that's what you want to do, is map the inside of the earth. So taking that a step further, Conoco tried putting some of these land machines out on a barge and see if they could vibrate within the water. Initially, that was a stationary source. They would put them on barges, sit still, very much like they do on land, and they would vibrate a point and then move and vibrate. Back in the mid-'80s, in Norway, I recall a situation where by that time we had, industry had developed one of the first marine vibrators, and it was hydraulic driven. In Norway, there was an issue with sand eels, little fish, and I'm not a biologist, but I do know that the regulatory agency did not want air guns, an air gun source to be used, so they used a marine vibrator. I've seen the data. The data came out actually pretty good. So this technology of marine vibricides could be an alternative to the use of air guns in some situations. And I say that with those caveats. I don't want anybody to think we've got a total replacement at this time. There are situations within the geology that require maybe more energy in one case than the other. So in some situations, these marine vibricides should work. Now, what's the advantage from an environmental point of view? The hypothesis is that the physical harm to these animals would be much less potential for that. To give you an example, I've said this many times, and for those that know me and heard it before, but I would be willing to put my hand on a marine vibrator as it's a working unit. But you would only do that one time if you put your hand on an air gun that had an exhaust on it. You wouldn't want to do that. So as far as physical harm, now, why did I pick out physical harm? Because we really don't have a clue yet behaviorally how animals are going to work or these systems are going to work around animals. It's hoped that it will be less impactful than a sudden sound, that it's more like nature where you hear the whales, they actually have sweeps themselves. They up sweeps, down sweeps. So it could be that it's less impactful from a behavioral point of view. But again, that's yet to be studied. Now, where are we today with the development of this technology? There is, before I left Exxon, my management supported me in starting a joint industry project on marine vibricides. Today, there are 3 companies that are still working together, 3 oil companies to support the development of marine vibricides technology. And they have gotten to the point where they're building prototypes. They've got 3 vendors that are taking completely different approaches as to how they're doing it, which is good. That's good competition. But they're developing prototypes. The next step will be to take those prototypes to the field, which they hope to do sometime this year. And you will do endurance testing. You'll do geophysical testing. How well does it perform geophysically? Then they will get into doing studies on environmental impacts.
So I'm going to ask a kind of follow-up question of one of the questions from the audience kind of hit on this point. And it basically says, what will it take to get G&G companies to use these kinds of tools? So maybe just you could talk about, the economic realities of implementing these things and the role that incentives or regulations might have in that.
Well, like Kathy said with her analogy, turtles and syrup, I felt that way with the marine vibricides. I've been pushing on this issue for many years. I think it's taken hold. I say that because you got 3 major companies that have committed some serious money to developing the technology. You got to look at it from their point of view too. Air guns is the only tool they have right now, so they need another tool. So they're motivated in that sense to come up with another tool. They're motivated by the direction of the way things are going from the regulatory issue. They're motivated by some of the stated environmental standards that they're supposed to have to their stockholders. So there is motivation to do it. Now, on the flip side, there are some that are not motivated. So when you talk about industry, it's kind of like Congress. Not everybody agrees, right? So the industry's the same way. You go to an API meeting, American Petroleum meeting, and we'll have different ideas. So you've got another industry called the seismic industry that supplies these tools. They have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into these big ships and air guns and long seismic cables and things. And all of you know human nature. Change doesn't come easy. People don't want to change. They get comfortable. They don't want to move. Same way with these, some of the companies, some, not all, some do not want to change because they're fully invested in this other technology. However, that being said, I think I see some of those attitudes have been changing recently because we're seeing more versions of different kinds of alternate sources coming out from some of the seismic companies. So I think hold on and stand by. We'll be seeing some different alternatives coming out other than just what's coming out of the Marine Vibe JIP.
Great, thanks, John. Another kind of technology-related question, switching back to the shipping industry, and Kathy, this is one we've kind of dealt with a lot, and maybe Mark, you can address kind of the physics of some of this, but it relates to the interaction of ship noise and ship strikes. And the question is, does decreasing propeller noise increase the risk of an individual whale being hit by a ship? And Mark, maybe if you want to just talk about some of the physics of that from your perspective.
I don't know the direct answer to that question at all. If it's a cavitation noise issue, that's a typically high-frequency phenomenon, so it depends on the type of animal and the bands that they can hear. When it comes to is decreased noise more likely for a whale to not know that a ship is around there? I would give a whale a little bit more credit. I think they're really intelligent and they have really good hearing. But again, this is really not my realm of expertise. I'm really more in the generation of noise. If it's something that's low frequency from a ship, that's say pumps or generators, those can be 60 hertz low frequency phenomena. They're typically pretty well vibration isolated in that way. And cavitation noise, as Kathy said, is a major component of that, and that's a typically high frequency phenomenon.
So John Kalmbakidis from Cascadia Research is doing a fair bit of work on noise and ship strike interactions and looking at tags, received levels of sound from ships and interactions using AIS data. So he's kind of addressed some of this. There's a few recent papers on it. The problem with ship strikes and noise is when animals are at the highest risk of being hit, which is in front of a ship and near the surface, they're already more shielded from the sound of the ship anyway, because especially for really big ships, the propellers in the back, you have the shield of the ship itself in front of it. And when animals get near the surface of the water, you have this phenomenon called Lloyd mirror, where the sound is actually reduced by the interaction of sound with different phases. Basically, it's quieter right near the surface. So for whales that are right in front of a ship, it's already a lot quieter. So it's a hard answer to that question. I mean, if it is a signal that they're using and you reduce it, you could make the case that they would be less likely to detect it. But they're already in a zone that they're less likely to be able to hear ships. We do see animals that evade ships from some of the work and I've worked with John on some of these projects. We actually did a project last year to play ship noise back to animals and look at their interactions. And they get pretty close to ships. There's a lot of close encounters that happen, but I think, and Kathy, maybe your perspective on this interaction between ship noise and ship strikes, it's kind of been like weird kind of bedfellows a few times, and it always comes up in the issue. And actually, even within the UN process, there was a panel in February that Kathy was on as well that dealt with both of these issues. They're kind of different, and they do interact to some degree, but what's your thought about kind of keeping these things separate or pulling them together, the interaction between them?
First, I apologize for this coughing. I caught my summer cold in New Orleans last week, so usually I have a light soprano voice. As not. The good news to me, and this is a non-scientist perspective, my background is I sailed for 6 years, came ashore, ministered some programs for the energy industry, and then came with the chamber. The good news, I think, is the ultimate solution to the ship strike issue And the noise issue is the same solution. Separate the animals from the ships. We've talked about this, and it's a hard solution to get to. We've talked about real-time reporting programs so that commercial shipping, say going to the Santa Barbara Ship Channel, would have a place to report a whale sighting. You do have to worry about duplicate reports for the same animals, but at least letting ships know that there's whales in this given area. I will tell you this much. There is no one that's ever stood to watch on the bridge of a ship that intentionally hits something in the water. First of all, you don't know what it is not to hit. So we would like to give a wide berth to whatever is lurking beneath the waves. And certainly, given the maneuverability of a, say, 1,000-foot long ship, would take as much evasive action as we could safely do and not put the ship on the rocks to get rid of it. So the technical side of designing quieter ships versus the issue of ship strikes is very different. But the ultimate solution is to keep the animals and the ships apart.
I think it's a really kind of important point. And another important point is we don't have the right kind of information about the spatial and temporal distribution of marine mammals in many cases to be able to make an informed decision about that. I mean, we're getting better, but there's the spatial and temporal distribution of the activity, but you need the biological information of what's when, where, and how it's changing, which can be a little bit.
Yeah, just real quick, I have to give my little philosophy. Everyone knows about the precautionary approach, right? And get in a room with people that are frowning and glaring and getting ready to scream at each other. I've always sat back and just looked. And, to get to the solution to difficult problems requires collaboration across all the stakeholders. The regulated community, the conservation, environmental community, the technical, the science, academic. The reason why I bring the precautionary approach up, and people will disagree with me on this, we all agree in concept what the precautionary approach should be relative to the application to these issues. Where we differ is where on that continuum is where you've got enough data to justify taking a particular action. On one side, die-hard, let's say, industrial, and I'm not saying the shipping industry or anybody, but on one side, you need 100% data to do one little regulatory thing. On the other side, you need one little piece of data to do all kinds of regulatory requirements. And in reality, if we can all think that we're somewhere in the middle of that continuum, we can get the solutions for this without disagreeing with each other, I think.
Here's an interesting question, which we'll be interested to see what people's perspectives are. It just says, if noise is one of the impacts of certain activities, shipping, drilling, et cetera, much like CO2 emissions are an impact, might there be a possible sound tax, like there are carbon tax policies? This would incentivize sound reduction and raise funds for science. John?
Yeah, actually, I worked on a panel, and still do, for the EU noise team, I guess you would say. And this comes up pretty often about, well, how do you motivate people to do noise reduction? Obviously, there's different ways. You can use the carrot, you can use the stick. And I think the example in Vancouver was a good example where they give a tax break for the folks that have quieter ships that come into port. There's been discussions of this tax on noise, noise budgets. You may have heard the word noise budget, where people are allowed so much noise. There's a lot of different ways, but I think going back to what Kathy was saying, the disagreement that you see among a lot of folks on this issue, there are people, as Kathy says, who have to have 100% data there's those that don't, and there's those in between. I think the language that we are to start working on and trying to get better at is doing better risk assessments. Can we get to a point to where we can start agreeing on risk assessments and we start putting more actual data into those risk assessments? I heard technology discussion yesterday about Internet of Things and the cloud data. If we could take that data and pump it into the risk assessments, because risk assessments are typically done by subject matter experts, and you and the audience know each one of us perceive risk probably differently. I mean, I'm not going to go in the ocean because there's things that can eat me there, so I'm not going. But maybe you love to dive, so we look at things differently. So we need data, more data, to kind of take some of the emotion out of the risk issue. And I'm not saying remove all subject matter expert input. I'm just saying let's get better at how we do it by using the data that we do have, although it may be scarce. If we scan the internet and the cloud, we may find more data. And with these new algorithms of data mining and analysis, I think we can come up with better risk assessments. And with that, I think we'll get closer toward getting the opposite ends to agree on things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the other advantage of doing that kind of risk assessment is you can evaluate where your weaknesses are as well. It gives you the ability to look at uncertainty and where the uncertainty happens. And I kind of come back to the point, in many of these cases, the uncertainty has to do with our not having enough information on when and where animals are.
Yeah.
In many cases. Mark.
Another way that you can think about the tax is, in some locations, regulations are based on, don't make a lot of noise around a particular animal or where we know there may be animals. But another way to do it, and this is often done in the North Sea, is just don't make noise regardless of if there's an animal or not. Because that noise, particularly the low frequency noise, is going to go somewhere, and it's going to contribute just like all the ships contribute to a total kind of background din. So what you see, for example, in Germany is a set noise limitation at a certain distance, regardless of if there's an animal or not. So you just always have to meet that, and that's kind of their effective tax. Interestingly, and by the way, for an offshore wind farm, they'll spend like 10 million euros on noise mitigation, just that. It's a significant, additional cost because of the regulations. And but another interesting thing that they'll do, say in other countries, if you're driving 20 monopile foundations for an offshore wind farm, you are allowed more noise. You can say be up to 170 dB at 750 meters, or for 100 piles it's 160 dB at 750 meters. So there is a concept of noise dosage, and in that way they're certainly paying for noise reduction, whether or not there's an animal there or not that's going to be to impact by it.
Okay, I'm going to ask kind of a related question. It goes back to the ship issue, but maybe you could address this kind of in a general sense. It relates to the issue of noise and efficiency. And it just says, can you talk about recent efforts in the last few years to address the data gap of noise and efficiency of ships, as well as the challenges and next steps? I wonder if you could touch on that, Mark, at all, or kind of relate it to issues about noise and just the efficiency of operations generally. So,
yeah, in a very general sense, when when you're not trying to make sound and you are, it's inefficient, right? The energy that would go towards something that's useful is going to something that's not useful. If you have a squeaky bike chain, your bike chain is supposed to be driving the gear, but instead you're putting all this energy into making all this annoying noise or anything. You compare it to pile driving, which is a particularly noisy phenomenon. You want to put all your energy into putting that pile, pushing it into the ground, but what you're really doing is you're pushing it into the ground, but you're also putting this nasty bulge wave in it that produces a heck of a lot of sound. And if you could just avoid that, then you'd put a lot of your energy towards something that's more useful. Same thing with any kind of essentially any kind of physical phenomenon. If you don't want sound and you're getting it, then you're being inefficient. Some things are a lot more noisy than other things. We're coming back to cavitation again. Bubbles are really, really good at making sound and absorbing sound. In fact, you can get temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun from collapsing bubbles. It's been shown. It's called sonoluminescence. It's an amazing phenomenon. Bubbles are really loud. They're a problem for active sonar systems. When you've got crashing waves, the sound that you send through these bubble clouds will absorb sound in no time. I mean, our whole technology is built around that. Instead of using bubbles to make sound, we use bubbles that want to start ringing, suck all that sound right out of the water. It's a well-known phenomenon. It works quite well. So yeah, it really is, what's the modality of your inefficiency? If your inefficiency is a vibration on a very small surface, it's not going to be very loud. If it's vibrating a very large plate, for example, on the hull of a ship, it's going to be really loud. Or if you're creating bubbles, then it's probably even worse in a lot of cases.
Great. I think you're hitting on the point that the technology is moving pretty quickly, and we're getting some ability to address some of these things with mitigation. How are recent behavioral response studies helping our understanding of how different sources affect marine mammals and other marine wildlife? Maybe I'll take that one. We've been working with mostly the US Navy, parts of the Navy, and other navies to do this. The JIP has funded some work to look at behavioral responses in seismic surveys in Australia. So there's kind of the last decade has seen a pretty rapid expansion of the use of these kind of tools. And I think my main perspective on it is that it's really revealing something which makes intuitive sense, which is the behavioral responses of these animals to sound is really dependent on a few key things. There are certain species that seem to be particularly sensitive for reasons relating to their social structure and their predation risk. And across other species, the probability of response really depends on what they're doing, which shouldn't be that surprising. What level of sound bothers you? If I ask you that question, if you're in a library versus a busy restaurant, the level is very different between those two things. So we're seeing that same kind of context dependency in behavioral response, which is challenging for the regulators that want to develop, a probability function of risk when you have contexts where the probability of response may differ by 40 dB. It's a huge difference. So there's some challenges in that realization, but it's just the way that the world is, that animals that are really motivated to stay somewhere, may not demonstrate a response, versus animals that are migrating and moving from one place to another may be more likely to divert course or leave an area because they're just passing through it, for instance. So I think it's, for one, there's a lot of really amazing technologies that have been developed out of these kinds of things that have impact on other applications, like studying the density of animals from passive acoustics is something that doesn't have to do with behavioral response studies. But in this behavioral response studies, we figured out how to identify how many times that whale is calling, and that call rate is then used in density estimations from passive acoustics. So there's a lot of technology transfer, but I think this context dependency is probably the best, the most important realization of it. And that's not just a context of behavioral state of what the animals are doing, but it's also this spatial range. So if animals get the same level of sound from something that's near them or something that's far away, their probability of response is really different. They're more likely to respond when something's close to them, which I think gets back to your point of these animals are smarter than we maybe give them credit for. They're able to figure out, like, hey, this is something that's near me, I'm going to respond differently. Is that good? Did I answer that one? Well,
yeah.
Okay.
I think you did a great job.
Well, that's actually one I've worked on. So. We got 5 minutes left here, so I'm going to try and make sure I get one that hits on everybody's perspectives. This is just kind of more of a point saying talk about ecosystem level effects, not specific species. And Patrick, maybe that's, and there's another question in here related to Atlantic seismic and what the current state of that is and how public can kind of get involved. And I know you guys have a habitat perspective on that issue. So I kind of take the point about ecosystem level issues. And if you want to comment on that, and then maybe just let people know kind of
Sure.
what the status of the Atlantic seismic issue.
Yeah, no, happy to. And as you alluded to at the beginning, Brendan, the iconic status of whales and marine mammals, they've tended to capture public attention, particularly when they're washing up on beaches, often in various noted incidents, including one featured in the Sonic Sea film in Madagascar in 2008. They've been directly and acutely impacted, particular species, by various forms of ocean noise, whether from prospecting or Navy sonar. But the broad impacts across the ocean environment and across the ocean ecosystem of a steady doubling every decade or so, at least up till 2008, of the amount of noise has cut the ability of species, and not just whale species, to communicate with each other and continue vital behaviors of feeding, migration, their own communication. And studies increasingly showing dramatic impacts on commercially viable fish stocks. So noise is steadily increasing in the ocean environment. We are the cause of that. It's impacting that ecosystem, broadly speaking, and species' ability to continue with their vital behaviors, their communication, and what have you. So the sources are several, as we have been outlining, and coming soon, if the Trump administration proceeds on its current course, will be renewed seismic testing in the North Atlantic, an area twice the size of California, from 15 miles off the East Coast to 350 miles, twice the size of California, will, as early as July 7th, if the 30-day comment period that's currently underway ends on July 6th. And I think there are 5 IHA's incidental harassment authorizations that are being sought from the administration. And as many in this room are aware, the president, in an executive order reversing the decision of the Obama administration for a 5 years moratorium till 2022, has directed that BOEM and NIMS consult and streamline the process whereby these permits, 5 separate permits, 5 different, yet overlapping, strongly overlapping seismic surveys will take place. There are communities and thousands of fishing families and tens of thousands of businesses, and I think 1,200 elected officials from local, city, national level electeds that are concerned about this. And there are, on both sides of the aisle, glimmers of hope in Congress in terms of concerns, obviously particularly from coastal members, with respect to this, both the seismic and the presumably subsequent drilling, a la Deepwater Horizon drilling, that is proposed to take place. And appreciating John's point and his own personal leadership and commitment on VibraSeis over many years, so far the seismic industry seems to be sticking to its guns, as it were, and wanting to set off explosions underwater that are among the loudest man-made sounds introduced into the marine environment, with a direct physical impact and behavioral impact on a whole range of species in that marine ecosystem. So it's something that we and other organizations represented here are acutely concerned about. Just to end on an optimistic note, Karen Sack at our opening breakfast yesterday from Ocean Unite said, yeah, well, NGOs, it's our job to be the kind of downers. And that doesn't come naturally to me. So to end on an optimistic note, I think that the ship strike discussion that we've been engaging in here is a good example of how U.S. leadership at the International Maritime Organization, Lyndon Johnson and others in 2009, introducing that issue. And the approach of the IMO, where we're all somewhere on that continuum that Kathy outlined in terms of just demanding more data and waiting versus willingness to take action. And we have found from an advocacy perspective that at IMO and the shipping industry generally has been willing to engage and take appropriate actions, particularly on the ship strikes issue, entertaining and supporting even movement of shipping lanes. There's some discussions now that are being driven, in fact, by the World Shipping Council, a sister organization to Kathy's organization, to protect blue whales off of Sri Lanka. Up to 80 blue whales a year are being hit in those waters. So there's reason for hope. That theme is echoed in the Sonic Sea film. If you're not aware of that, go to sonicsea.org, and you can see Kathy, Brandon, Sting, Rachel McAdams, and other stars, and some of the world's top scientists explaining this issue and identifying some solutions going forward. So there is real reason for concern with the present course of the administration, a proud record of leadership, and some opportunities, as we've heard today, for people of goodwill to engage industry, NGOs, leading researchers, and other stakeholders to mete out, hopefully more through cooperation than collision, some solutions as we move forward in these waters.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we're out of time. I'm sorry I didn't get to every one of the cards on here. There were a lot more about the Atlantic seismic events, so our proposals, and so we'll kind of point people to some of the sites that you mentioned. There'll be some other sites, the UN voluntary commitment, the ECHO program in Vancouver, the current public comment period for the NOAA acoustic guidelines, which we didn't talk about, but that have been reopened for comment with the last executive order. And I think we have a great panel. I appreciate the contributions of the really expert folks here. And I would leave with that same theme. You know, there's reason for hope in this. We've got, you know, a lot of technology that is growing rapidly, and we have some cross-sectoral partnerships, and, you know, focusing on the issues that really matter, and using some new ways of thinking and partnerships on this is the way forward. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close, and thank everyone for their participation.
Thank you all very much. It was a really informative panel. I really appreciate it. Just remind everyone, our next session is on America's public waters. It's at 11 a.m. During this break, we have about 30 minutes. Please take time to visit our exhibitors and stop by the Sanctuary Story Map. Also, don't forget to turn into Oceans Live. And I really want to take a moment to just thank the incredible team at Oceans Live that is preparing additional information during our breaks. One final reminder, it's not too late for Premier registration. You can stop by the registration table. We have a great happy hour tonight, sponsored by Vulcan. And we're going to have a wonderful session tomorrow morning that's just open to the Premier members about why elections matter, and really what about engagement in elections for ocean and coastal conservation. So thank you very much. We'll see you back here at 11.